Hi everyone, welcome to this week's episode of Sex Ed Taught Me. My name is Natalie Walton and I'm your host of this podcast. It's brand new, so I'm really excited to be sharing it with you all. Today our guest is Daven, who is the author of The Invincible Summer of Juniper Jones, as well as just a good friend of mine. I'm super excited for you all to get to meet her. In this episode, you will hear all sorts of things about what it was like growing up in California, just kind of the different interesting or funny or just kind of sometimes borderline inaccurate stories and things that she learned about sex growing up. Overall, I think it'll be a great time, and I'm super excited for y'all to get to listen to it. So without further ado, here is the episode.
I'm Daven. I met Natalie on the internet in 2014.
All right, off to a strong start. Thank you for joining me. All right, so kind of as a broad overview, just like jumping right into it, so we have context. Can you tell me a little bit about like your hometown or hometowns if you moved around a little bit? Just kind of like politically, socially, how big was your school? Was it private, public, that kind of idea? Like kind of paint a picture for where you were.
Yeah, so I grew up in Torrance, California, which is a suburb of LA, but doesn't really feel like LA. It's very like white, suburban, close to the beach town, fairly conservative. I went to a public high school, about like 2,000 kids, that had like a very involved like parent presence. And yeah, I mean, I would say a lot of my classmates were more conservative. I like can definitely name a few people who voted for Trump. Yeah, that's
all right,
that's
cool.
the place.
And then what age around would you say you started sex ed? Was this like a middle school, high school? I know in some areas it starts in like elementary school. Like where would you fall in that? What age group for formal sex ed, I guess I should say?
Yeah, I guess so. Like we had some like mini lesson things in like 5th and 6th grade, but it was kind of like, this is what a period is, and like this is what, like, I don't know, whatever. It was like they separated like girls and boys and did like gendered lessons. But my first real sex ed class was in freshman year of high school. We took a health class, and sex ed was like a unit of that.
I had the same thing. Do you know like what your sex ed class would be considered? So I know this is kind of like a niche thing to even think about. Like I spend a lot of time thinking about it where I'm like, oh, did you have like an abstinence only program, like an abstinence based, a comprehensive, like where do you think you would fall in that? Or if you know like what actual sex ed program you had?
I would say it was probably abstinence based.
Okay. Yeah, because I guess that would be, for context, abstinence-based is like where they heavily imply that that's what you should do. Like it's not the only option,
Yeah.
but that's kind of, they're like, well, you probably should. Like just, how about we just be abstinent? And that's like
that's basically.
Yeah, all right. And then, so when you think broadly about your experiences, so you mentioned going back to like, maybe like 5th, 6th grade, but when you're thinking about kind of your childhood, when was the first time you kind of became aware of the fact that like, like sex was something, like this was like something people did, this was like your body was like used for something, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I think I really only had a concept of it as like how babies are made. Like I remember being like maybe 6 or 7, and my mom just like one day handed me this purple book, and it was like about human anatomy and like sex, but like I don't think it ever said the word sex in it, and it was like for children, and we never spoke of it, but she gave it to me.
All right, awesome. And then how did you learn about sex? So this is kind of a loaded question that can like verge into a whole bunch of different areas. So it's, you mentioned like your parents, you mentioned school, but like there's also, you know, friends and things like that. Like I remember being in like middle school and being told like you know, Google like what a blue waffle is. Like that was like pinnacle of humor when we were in like, you know, like 11. So it's, you know, just kind of things like that was part of how I learned about sex and part of my perception of it. So just different things like that, if you remember different stories or like from friends, the internet, parents, that kind of idea.
Yeah, probably definitely most from not friends, but like people at school. I remember that there was actually one point where I had like a decent sort of informal sex ed with my biology teacher. She like set up this ancient website thing where everyone could ask like anonymous questions about sex and she would answer them in class. And like most of the questions were like ridiculous questions, but she would answer them like completely straight-faced. And this was in 7th grade. But probably like the first time I like really like learned about sex was in like 6th grade. My middle school was like at the bottom of a hill, and from like the like recess area you could see like a blank face of the hill that was just like grass, and people used to toilet paper different things on there, like they would like put their names or whatever. And so one day someone drew a penis on the hill.
Of course.
And I was in PE and I was like, that's such a weird pair of scissors. And this guy turns to me and he's like, what? And I was like, the pair of scissors. Why did someone draw a pair of scissors? And then it was explained to me what it was. I was like, oh, yeah, okay. People also used to TP 69 on the hill a lot. And I was like, what's that number?
Yeah. So. I almost feel like 69 is one of those things where like like people learn about it before they know what it means. Like they're like, oh, haha, like 69, but they're like,
yeah,
I don't know what that actually is. Like I don't know. I feel like the joke started before people had like an awareness. They were like, oh.
Yeah.
Oh. And then, so thinking about like your classes and like the questions that were answered in your health class, was there anything that was just like completely false? Like you think about it now and you're like, I cannot believe somebody was paid to stand in front of a room and tell us that. Like,
nothing that I can think of that's like actually false, but like, I mean, it was just so like my health class in freshman year, like basically sex ed was, we spent like a couple weeks going through this long PowerPoint of STDs that have like visible infections, and like it was just pictures of infected genitalia for like just one after the other for ages.
Wow.
And it was just my teacher being there like, and this is gonorrhea, and this is like, it was an experience.
I'm like trying to imagine.
No,
like
there was no like, oh, like you should use this type of protection to avoid this type. It was just like, here's what is going to happen to you if you have sex.
That's so weird. Honestly, that feels like sex ed to me. Like when people say like, oh, I had sex ed, like I think of that exact experience of like like a bunch of like, you know, 14-year-olds sitting around a room just looking at these like pictures and just basically being like, yeah, this is what's gonna happen. Like,
yeah.
That's so funny. So this is a similar question, but just a little bit different. So what were you actually told about sex? So like if you could summarize what sex was supposed to be to you as a teenager growing up, like what, if you could sum that up in like 1 or 2 words, what do you think it would be that like your parents or your teachers wanted you to like take away from your lessons?
Probably don't do it. That was kind of it. Like
no, I definitely yeah. No, I feel like that's kind of the big, like, abstinence based, like anything that's like abstinence heavy is very big on like the just don't, it's bad. Just like you'll do it eventually, but don't do it now. Like that's
Yeah,
pretty much
yeah,
they're like, we'll tell you just enough and then that'll be it. And then good luck.
yeah. It was like, here's every bad thing that could possibly happen, and so like we're gonna try to scare you out of doing this.
Yeah, people love their fear-based tactics for public health. It's really it's good, I think, for kids.
Yeah.
It just seems like that's going to have a really positive effect.
Yeah, totally.
And then why that? So why do you think it was don't do it? Was there any particular reason? Like, do you think it was, you know, part of the area? You mentioned it being just a little bit conservative, which tends to, not to generalize, but typically conservative party tends to lean more toward don't do sex ed. If you do have sex ed, it's abstinence only, that kind of idea. Or was it just kind of an idea of like, we don't want to talk to kids about sex, so let's not really do it? You know, where do you think it fell in that?
Yeah, well, so I heard stories from friends who had older siblings who went to my school in like the early 2000s, who said that they used to have like a condom demonstration on like a zucchini. And then parents found out about it and were like, no. And like kind of ever since then, I think it's been more and more abstinence-based. I think it is like mostly because of the area and like people just don't want their kids exposed to whatever. And yeah, I mean, like even the like stuff that we did get that was more explicit, it was like ridiculous videos of like flying penises like with wings that would just like fly across the screen. That's like my most vivid memory. This was from like
I need a little bit more context to that.
I think it was like flying penises and like flying vaginas, and they were like, this is how a baby happens. So,
scientifically proven, that's what it comes down to. Oh my god. Like, and I thought I had embarrassing videos of my sex ed classes. They were like, I don't even think we got videos per se in mine. Like it was very much just kind of like, don't do it. Like that was like the extent of the conversation. Like they never showed. We watched, I think, probably 2 videos the entirety of my health class, and one of them was about like internet safety and the other one was about fast food, and that was it. Everything else, it was like,
oh yeah, the fast food one.
Yep. And it was like my teacher just kind of imply, like he'd be like, people have penises, and then everyone would laugh in the class, and then that would be it. Like that was the the extent of our conversation, and I'm like, okay, this is really helpful, thank you.
Yeah. Learning so much.
But how do you think this has affected you as a person? Like when you think back to these classes and who you are now as a person, and I don't know, maybe like your development through your teen years, like, do you think this had an impact on you, or were you kind of just like, whatever? Like,
I mean, I do think to some degree, I think it was that, and also like being raised Catholic, I was like, sex bad, pregnancy immediately, die. Like that's it. Like it was very like, that was my mentality with like very Mean Girls. But yeah, I mean, like, I think like I think partly because of like being raised on the internet, I like wasn't as affected by my shitty sex ed classes as I might have been. But definitely it did like strike the fear of God in me a little bit.
Yeah, I'm like, I went to public school too, and I'm like thinking about it, and I'm like, yeah, no, I was not raised in a particularly like religious family or anything like that, but there were still these like little things that I feel like would slip into it because both my parents were raised Catholic, so it's like little tiny, and like my area was pretty heavily Catholic, so it's kind of like, you know, just little, maybe don't Like it's,
Yeah.
let's think about how this is going to look,
Yeah.
how are you going to be perceived in the eyes of God? And it's like, I don't even go to a Catholic school. Like I don't like, this is not my, and I would still feel like guilted into it. And I'm like, you're right.
Yeah.
You're absolutely right. I'm like, okay, I don't know. It's the same thing with, I don't know, just hearing the different stories about like, well, obviously birth control doesn't work. And it's like, well, okay, like right?
Yeah. I remember sitting once in church on a Sunday, and the priest gave an entire sermon about how birth control is like the greatest sin against God, and I was just sitting there like, what?
Oh. It's like, okay. Yeah, no, that was one of the biggest things that I remember. We would get like external groups who would come in and like have demonstrations. I think we got like 2 different people, and it was meant to be like the balanced perspective of like, let's bring in, somebody from more of like a like kind of a religious group, someone who's a little bit more conservative, that kind of idea. They were really big on that idea of like, the more partners you have, like the less you'll care about your partners. Like they were really tried to sell that of like, well, it's if you have, once you reach 7, you're not going to care about any of your partners anymore after that point. It's, you can't form an emotional connection. And everyone's like, I don't think that's how that works. Like, I'm like, I don't have a psychology background and I might be 14, but like, I don't know if that's true or not. And I don't know if I could, like, I don't know. All right. So jumping into another question. So how comprehensive do you think your understanding of sexuality was as a teen? So you mentioned like getting a book from your mom, you mentioned using the internet, you mentioned having like questions online with your teacher. Like, do you think that was a comprehensive education, or do you feel like there were things that like were definitely missing that you kind of just like learned along the way as you grew up?
Yeah, I think there was definitely stuff missing. I think like the conversation of consent was just not present in any of the sex ed classes that I had. I mean, the one sex ed class that I had, that was just like not a thing at all that I didn't like. I mean, something that you like, I knew kind of implicitly, but like it wasn't really discussed until college.
No, I had the same experience.
So like, yeah. So like in that sense, I feel like it wasn't comprehensive, and it also wasn't like, there wasn't anything, it was always just like the mechanics of how sex works, but only like heterosex.
Mm-hmm.
And like, there was no conversation about like pleasure or like, I don't know, experimentation or anything like that.
Yeah, no, I feel like we honestly probably had really similar class structures, because when I think about mine, I'm like, I don't remember what we talked, you know what I mean? Like, as I think about it, I'm like, I don't know if I actually retained anything from the class. I feel like the whole goal of the class was to be like as forgettable as possible, like basically scare kids and just kind of like ingrain in them that they shouldn't do this thing. And then that's pretty much it. And after that point, they were like, well, health, not a concern for us. They're like, just don't get pregnant. But like every other aspect of it, well, it's like, it doesn't need to be fun. Like it, that kind of idea. And it's like, an interesting take. Cause I do feel like there's kind of this expectation when people are like, well, sex ed should be comprehensive. Like it should teach you about different things. And like, the fact that it should be pleasurable rather than painful and that kind of idea. And people are like, no, like you can't tell kids that. And it's like, well, realistically, a lot of them probably already know. When you think statistically, it's like, I mean, there are kids who are 14, 15 who are already like sitting in their sex ed classes who are like, yeah, duh, like obviously this is how it works. And then you have other kids who are like, like with your PETA story, it's like where it's still kind of, like there's little pieces here and there, but you're like, you're still learning and you're still growing. So yeah, I think it's really kind of difficult to almost, I feel like sex ed classes, it's like trying to figure out how to sell these lessons without being like, yeah, we want to teach your kids how to have sex. Like, I feel like that's the hardest thing is like people hear sex ed and they're like, I don't want you to be like teaching positions. I don't want, and it's like, we don't do that. I promise that's not the goal. Like that is not like, like people are not going and trying to like teach people how to do it. Like, that's what, like, you know, Cosmo's for in a couple of years, like, whatever. But
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah. I always find the conversations around it really interesting, and like how quickly sex ed turned into this thing of like, you know, oh, you're gonna teach my kid how to have sex and they're going to want
Totally.
to. And it's like, well, they're having it already anyway, so
Yeah.
I don't know what to tell you. But when you think about kind of this comprehensive sex, or, you know, lack of, how has your understanding of sex changed over time? So are there things that are, you know, that you've kind of learned? Have your opinions changed in certain ways? Like, you know, was there anything that you internalized that you've kind of moved past, or, you know, have certain values kind of taken over other ones, that kind of idea?
Yeah. I mean, I would say like, yeah, a big part of what I learned in sex ed was just strictly like man, woman, penis, vagina. That's how sex happens. And I was like, guess there's no other way. And I think like, and also like just the focus in general in sex ed of being like only penetrative sex is like actually sex. And like, and some of that makes sense because it's like, that's how pregnancy happens, whatever. But like, yeah, I think like my idea of like what sex actually is was so narrow when I was like in high school and learning these things, because it was just like, oh, like it's only sex if there's a penis inside of me. And I was like, I don't know if I want that, but yeah, I would say like definitely as time has gone on, I've like realized more of like what like a broad category of actions sex is and can be. Yeah.
And do you think some of this was like intentional growth? Was this like knowledge that you sought out, or was it like somebody kind of like, I don't want to say intervened because that sounds really dramatic, but like kind of like came in and like taught you something new, like maybe like, you know, a doctor, that kind of idea, like where you kind of accidentally learned information, or they were actually trying to teach you something? Like, I know for me, I volunteered at Planned Parenthood already kind of knowing stuff, but like I was still learning things. Like I went in to start interning there, and all of a sudden I was like, wait, there's like all of these different like terms and different things and just different like pieces of sex ed that are so vital that I think it kind of lost along the way. So if there's anyone who kind of like came in, or if it was just kind of, you know, you learned because you got older and you don't really know how you learn this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I would say part of it is was during like freshman orientation, they had a lot of, I mean, it was mostly like, it wasn't sex ed, it was like mostly consent-based workshops. But I feel like that was kind of the start of it. And from there, it was mostly like me just learning things.
Yeah, no, I definitely feel that, because I think about like my growth between like like when I think about being, you know, I want to say maybe I was like 10 or 11. Do you remember the show Secret Life of the American Teenager, or Secret Life of an American Teenager, or something like that? There was an ad for it that would show all the time on, I guess, what was ABC Family and is now Freeform. And it was like, like she was so insistent. She was like, like we just kissed, like we didn't actually have sex, like we just kissed. I don't know what happened. And I like internalized the shit out of that. Like I was like, oh, obviously kissing can lead to pregnancy. Like I like, oh my God, we have to be so careful. Like this is like a big thing. Why don't people warn us about this? Because it's like I had never watched this show. Like I don't like,
yeah.
it was like I didn't actually like think about the context around it. I was just kind of like, oh my God, like they didn't even have sex. Like they just like, and I remember telling a friend and being like, you know, be careful about kissing. Like it's, you know, it can like that's how like Amy got pregnant. Like, it's like, that's so embarrassing. But I'm like, I can't, the worst part is I can't even remember the growth from like then to now, where I'm like, who taught me that wasn't the case?
Yeah.
Like I genuinely am like, I learned it from somewhere. Like
yeah.
But I don't know, it's like, because my parents didn't really do like the sit down and be like, hey, so here's the deal, like it's just, we never really ended up having any conversations like that. I got this like American Girl puberty book, and that was like the extent of our talk about like bodies and growing up and like changing and stuff like that. Just like, otherwise, like, I guess the internet, movies, like, I don't know,
Yeah.
like, was there a point when I was intentionally seeking this stuff out? Like, I have no idea. It just feels like I woke up one day and all of a sudden I was like, yeah, obviously, like,
Yeah, same.
yeah. Like, I'm like, well, probably not good. I did not learn that in the formal classroom
Yeah.
and during the actual sex ed class I was supposed to be having. But it's I guess it's good I learned it anyway.
Yeah, got there eventually.
Yeah, it's kind of, I'm like, it's good, but it also kind of is a reminder of like how far we can like veer off track, you know what I mean, with these ideas of like, at this point I feel pretty confident that like most people realize that like, there was was it the rumor that like if you had sex at night you couldn't get pregnant. Like there was like a genuine thing where people are kind of like, yeah, it was like, the sperm was like sleeping, so if you planned it correctly like you wouldn't. And like I don't know how many people genuinely believed it, but I would hear it constantly, and like it was like this like sentiment that kept getting passed around enough for it to be like impactful on me. Like I remember it when I think about it, I'm like, that's so
Yeah.
like like it just, when you hear it sounds fake, like it's just like,
Yeah.
it's like, oh, what? That's
where am I sleeping?
It's like obviously they can't go
Wild.
anywhere, they're tired. They have to rest, I guess. Like that's just, it's so funny to me. So I'm like,
God.
how many other things that I didn't hear about or other people retaining because they read like one post on the internet and they're like, well, yeah, that's how it works. And it's like, I obviously can't knock that, considering how I genuinely believe that you could get pregnant from kissing for probably much longer than I should have. I can't pass any judgment on anyone. I'm just kind of like, man, it leaves so much space. Like when you don't actually teach people what sex is, like when you don't sit them down in like a formal classroom, you're just kind of being like, go find it elsewhere. And it's like, well, who's to say where you're going to find it? Like what are you going to find? That kind of idea. So I always do think that's really interesting. Like I could have ended up on a totally different path with what I know and what I think about sex too.
Yeah.
And we kind of talked about this a little bit already, but what do you hope to see in the future when it comes to learning about sex and understanding sex? Like, is there anything where if you could guarantee that like every kid by a certain age knew like a piece of information, what would it be for you?
I think I'd want comprehensive consent teaching and like understanding of consent, and then queer inclusivity. Because it's just so straight.
I'm like, I don't think it was ever once addressed in my class. Like it was just never really said. It was kind of this implication of like, well, if it happens, it's, the consequences won't be as bad as otherwise. So you don't need to talk about it. It'll just make everyone uncomfortable. And it's like, well, not like maybe it's like maybe that's not the way we should be thinking about things. Maybe that's not the way sex ed should be taught. But I don't know. I'm like, but yeah, I did go to a pretty aggressively straight high school, I think, or like at least like when everyone was in high school, it was like after we got out, everyone was like, oh,
yeah,
wait.
Oh, totally.
And I'm just like, I wonder how many people could have like, I don't know, just like gone on a slightly different path or felt more comfortable being open with their sexuality if they'd learned about it at the age of like 14. And if someone had very casually suggested like, it would be okay, like this is fine.
Yeah.
But it's definitely like, I don't know. I do like to think that there would be a difference. And I really do think environment plays a huge role. And also the idea of just teaching consent is huge for me. I mean, that's one of the big driving forces behind why I focus so much on sex ed, is being able to teach people and just be like, hey, not only is, you know, you should be having healthy sex, but you should be having communication about sex, and you should be talking to people, and you should actually know kind of what you want, what your partner's expecting, you know, that kind of idea. I think that is so vital, and it's something where nobody ever really teaches you. Like, I know for me, I got a little bit in college. I mean, I intentionally sought out being like on a hotline, so that was where I got the majority of my training on stuff and being able to confidently talk about things like consent. But it's like, I don't know what everyone else got, you know what I mean? Like, it's when I think about where everyone else stands, I like to believe that they have an understanding of it, because there are other trainings offered on campus, but it's kind of like I don't actually know. Like, I have no idea what people are thinking or what they learned or what they come into college thinking or knowing or believing, that kind of idea.
Yeah, for sure. I think like for some people, the idea of consent, they get as far as like, no means no. Yeah. And that's it. Like, that's the entirety. Which, yeah, is not great.
Yeah, it's definitely like, I don't know. I think people like to kind of play off of this like whole, well, it's so nuanced, it's so difficult to understand. And it's like, it's just communication. Like, if you were taught from a young age how to communicate with people on this stuff, it wouldn't feel as uncomfortable or as like gray and difficult. Like, it would be a pretty straightforward conversation. I think if we started at a younger age and with clearer terms, and was just kind of like, yeah, you know, this is what's unacceptable, this is how you should talk to people, that kind of idea. But I know that's one of the big things that people focus on. Like I mentioned earlier, that there are some places where sex ed will start in like elementary school. I mean, it's more common in like certain parts of Europe, not so much in the US, but kind of the idea of like teaching people things like how to listen to a no when you hear it, or you know, just kind of understanding the concept of like personal space, or like when somebody doesn't want you to like touch them, that kind of idea, like how to communicate that and how to listen to it, which I think is really, really important. And I don't know, I'm just like, yeah, that totally makes sense to me. Like, there's like no question about it. I'm like, I absolutely think everyone should be learning that. So yeah, fully on board. But I think that is about the extent of what I have. I think that's, I mean, if you have anything else you would like to share, any sort of little weird anecdotes that are still floating around in your brain, you are more than welcome. I love to laugh. I think sex ed inherently is hilarious. Yeah. And I take it really seriously, but also like it is so incredibly uncomfortable inherently, and just like so uncomfortable. It's so funny. And I love hearing stories about it.
I do have one other story from my class in freshman year. We basically, like, we did sex ed, and we transitioned from sex ed into like the birth section, which was like kind of part of sex ed. It was like another like, let's scare you into not getting pregnant.
Of course.
But we learned about all the trimesters and all the process, and then at the very end of the unit, we watched a birth video, which I think is like fairly common in sex ed classes. And so my teacher like plays this video. It's very like standard birth, like in the hospital, in the gown, legs up, whatever. And like the baby comes out, and it was like fine. I mean, we were like, okay, like this is happening. And then she gets to the end, and she turns and like smiles at us, and she was like, now let's put it back in. And she played the video backwards. So we just saw the doctor shoving this baby back into a woman's vagina. And she was cackling. She thought it was so funny. And we were all just horrified.
Oh my God. Because I remember a similar video being shown, and like I for some reason never saw it. Like, I don't know like what the deal was with that. Like, I never got a unit on like birth, like that was just like never something I actually learned anything about, which now that I think about is super concerning. But like I remember hearing that I missed watching the like birth video in my science class of all things. And everyone was like people started like, you know, like getting so uncomfortable in class, and just like they were like, oh my God, I have to leave. Like it was just like they couldn't do it. And like they were just like, you're so lucky for having missed it. Like it's so good you didn't see it. And now I'm like, honestly, I think the situation would have been about 1,000 times worse if the teacher was like, let's watch it backwards. Like I think that's the only way it could have been made worse. Like
yeah, no, it was not great.
like I just can't get over an adult standing in front of a classroom and being like, yeah, let's do this. It's like, this is how the human body works. Like, all right, awesome. I'll be thinking about that one. That's gonna stick with me. That I will be processing that. All right, thank you so much for talking with me, and have a good one. Hi everyone. Before we, tune out, I just wanted to say thank you so much for listening to this episode of Sex Ed Taught Me. Thank you for supporting this podcast and supporting this kind of, ridiculous hodgepodge idea that I came up with. Because I wanted to see it and try it out and see what happens. A huge thank you to Jake Miller, who is the editor and kind of just he mixes the podcast, he puts this all together for us. I honestly think he's the reason why you're even hearing it right now. So huge thank you to him, and huge thank you to our guests who are coming onto the show. If you are interested, you can find us on Twitter and Instagram at Sex Ed Taught Me. So hopefully it should be pretty easy to find. And if you want to send anything in to us, if you would like to be a guest, if you just have a funny story you'd like to share, if you have any questions or things you want to clarify, or whatever reason it might be, you can also email us at sexedtaughtme@gmail.com. But again, thank you so much for tuning in, and see you next time.